All of that sounds well and good, but we're in the midst of a cyclical downturn. Anytime you talk about a manufacturing industry, you have these periods where customers have too much inventory on hand.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Chipstock Investor. Happy Monday. Hope you all had a good weekend, either taking it easy or at work. We're back today to talk about one of our top chip stocks of 2024 on semiconductor. And we're going to mix in a little bit of coverage on two of our other small cap companies that we like, Axcelis Technologies and Aehr Test Systems.
Casey, before we talk about on semi earnings, maybe give the folks watching a 10,000 foot view of what we're talking about.
Let's take a look at our semiconductor industry flow chart to see where these three companies fit in. On the top left, you can see On Semiconductor, an integrated device manufacturer. They design and produce their own semiconductors. In the center there, you see wafer fab, packaging, and assembly equipment. That's where Aehr Test Systems and Axcelis Technologies fit in. They provide the equipment that makes or tests the semiconductors.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to come back to this here in a few moments after we talk about Onsemi's quarter and what it means for the current downturn that we're in the midst of for power and industrial chips. That's what Onsemi specializes in. But we're going to talk about how this relates to baking a cake. This is the baking a cake process step for a company like On Semiconductor. So think of Onsemi as like a bake shop. We're going to come back to that. Promise.
Before we go over the high level numbers, take a look at some of the markets that On Semiconductor is playing in. You can see energy infrastructure, charging, factory automation, advanced safety, 5G, cloud power, and what you may be most familiar with, and their biggest market is electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are such a big part of On Semiconductor's business. You can see that On Semiconductor's business is very much tied to silicon carbide, which is a key component in electric vehicles. They have the fastest growing SiC business in the industry, and they're working on making their supply chain even stronger, having an end-to-end supply chain from boules to modules placed in electric vehicles. This part of the industry contains a lot of companies and a lot of manufacturing equipment. If you're interested in knowing a bit more, going deeper into each of these companies and the equipment that they produce, you can check out our semiconductor, wafer fab, and packaging equipment manual that we produced just this year. We'll make sure we put a link in the description and here on the video.
Okay. High level picture of what the first quarter of 2024 looked like. You can see the company's revenue at this point has been almost completely refocused on automotive, especially electric vehicles, but all sorts of power chips that go into the modern vehicle, and then power infrastructure. That could be everything from the electronics, the power chips needed in a wind turbine, to electric vehicle charging stations, to that factory equipment that needs, in many cases, a lot more energy, a lot more power than older equipment. They also have some sensors. Onsemi is the leader in high-end vision sensors. All of that sounds well and good, but we're in the midst of a cyclical downturn. Anytime you talk about a manufacturing industry, you have these periods where customers have too much inventory on hand. And so they kind of push back on a company like Onsemi and say, hold off on sending us more chips. So that's what's going on right now. In the first quarter of 2024, revenue was down 5% year over year to just shy of 1.9 billion. Gross margin on products sold took a little bit of a hit, just below 46%. Operating margin down to about 28.2% on a GAAP basis. However, free cash flow profit margin, which is a better measure of a company's actual operation when you back out one-time items and just look at what the business operation itself is doing, including the purchase of equipment, of machinery needed to manufacture chips. You can see those profit margins actually took a decent step up, 2.3 basis points higher quarter over quarter. But about that downturn, which we started talking about in October, November of last year, we said companies like Onsemi and the entire industrial chip part of the semiconductor industry was headed for a downturn that was going to last through roughly the midway point of 2024, through the summer of 2024. So you can see that here in Onsemi's guidance for Q2, which goes through June. We're looking at a worsening of the situation from Q1. Revenue expected to drop 22% year over year, and profit margins expected to dip quite a bit more in the spring quarter. Now, we're still looking at a recovery in the second half of the year, though.
CEO Hussein Al Khoury had something to say about this rebound. He said that they continue to gain market share in silicon carbide and diversify across all markets, and they still expect the revenue to increase 2 times the market growth in 2024. Now, outside of silicon carbide, he said that there was incremental softness in the market in the first quarter, and inventory is still being digested across the automotive and industrial markets, with stabilization in the traditional part of the industrial business for Onsemi. He said that they remain cautious about the second half outlook, but they do expect that customer inventory levels will normalize and the market will stabilize.
Maybe just a brief side point here. In addition to electric vehicles, silicon carbide chips being a top growth industry for power chips, of course, the entire investment world is focused on artificial intelligence and those very large, powerful systems getting installed in data centers to support this new AI industry. Those also consume significantly more power than a traditional data center server. In fact, Al Khoury said on the earnings call that some of these servers require as much power as a battery electric vehicle. So on semi, this is not a big market for them, but this is most definitely a play as well on data center power, really anything involving energy consumption. And when a company is interested in getting more efficient in its consumption of electricity, a company like Onsemi is going to benefit long term.
Here's Onsemi's slide regarding the Q2 guidance, ultimately just re-emphasizing the point that we're going to continue to see softness in this first half of the year before things start normalizing and growing all the way up into 2027.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a secular growth trend. A lot of people looking at the electric vehicle industry as the secular growth trend, but I think we really need to broaden our scope here and just talk about this in the context of getting more efficient in our use of electricity and our use of power. That's what Onsemi is. It's a specialty chip bake shop that participates in this broad secular growth trend of power consumption.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that bake shop and why we're using this illustration with companies like Onsemi and then Axcelis and Aehr Test Systems.
Yeah, that's right. This is a good illustration because if you think of On Semiconductor as the company that actually bakes the cakes, it helps explain some of the pain that's trickling down to the equipment makers, Axcelis and Aehr, that supply companies like Onsemi and some of its other power chip peers like ST Microelectronics, ticker symbol STM, Wolfspeed, ticker symbol Wolf, and some others. Those equipment makers are getting hit a lot harder than On Semi has been. And this slide helps explain it. You can see the last 12-month free cash flow performance for On Semi is actually increasing. So the trailing 12 months in 2023, just 402 million in free cash flow. But then the 12 months end in Q1, it's all the way up to 591 million. So On Semi's profitability actually improving in this particular profitability metric. Casey, what's the reason why?
Onsemi is spending a lot less on their equipment to bake the cakes. You can see In Q1 2024, they had 222 million in capex spending, and in Q2, they expect 180 to 220 million.
Yeah, that's a sizable reduction from the nearly 1.6 billion they spent last year. And you already alluded to this, Casey. For the last 2 years in particular, companies like Onsemi were spending a lot of money on equipment to get their silicon carbide fab or cake baking shops up and running. They now have those cake bake shops up and running for silicon carbide. So they're naturally going to need a bit less equipment. But in addition to that, a lot of customers are saying, hey, we don't need as many of those really tasty silicon carbide cakes as we originally thought. So if onsemi is selling fewer cakes, they buy less equipment. That's what you're seeing here in this chart in CapEx, capital expenditures, spending on equipment.
Something that Corey said on the earnings call shows that they're not going to be spending any more money on more equipment until they start selling more cakes or silicon carbide modules. He said that they see a stabilization of the market. They do not see that deteriorating any further, but ultimately it's stabilization. They don't see a recovery yet.
So by now, we already did the quarterly update for Aehr Test Systems, which is a very, very small company at this point. Axcelis, which we still consider part of our small cap basket, even though the market cap is about $4 billion. They compete against primarily Applied Materials in ion implantation machines. Applied is the big market leader. So Axcelis, very much a specialist small cap at this point. But just to kind of extend our little illustration here a little bit further, Onsemi is now reducing and maybe holding steady in their purchase of equipment from Axcelis and Aehr Test Systems. These companies, again, Axcelis, ion implantation machines, Aehr Test Systems, test and burn-in machines. These are very critical steps in a power chip, and especially a silicon carbide power chip used in electric vehicles and other next-gen power infrastructure. What do these companies do exactly? How can we think of this in the context of Onsemi as a bake shop?
Just a quick refresher on Axcelis Technologies, and their primary product is the ion implantation machine. And we're showing you a periodic table of the elements, not because this is chemistry class, but just so that you understand that the ion implantation machine adds these elements to the wafer to dope it, to help it become a semiconductor material. And you can think about this in our illustration as icing a cake. In order to make a more delicious cake, maybe you need to stuff it with some icing or put some icing on that cake. That's exactly what Axcelis ion implant machines do. They add extra elements to the semiconductor wafer to make the finished product that we know and use in our devices.
And let's keep going with that here. Aehr Test Systems. Some of those cakes that Onsemi makes, maybe it's a rum cake or a fruit cake, and there's alcohol in it, and it tastes better with age. So you need to age the cake, but maybe that process takes too long. So Aehr Test Systems makes what's called burn-in equipment that helps accelerate the aging process, speeds it up, and helps control that process for consistency. So those ultimate rum cakes or fruit cakes that come off the manufacturing line are exactly what the customer ordered.
When we were discussing this video, I said that my grandma aged her fruitcakes in the freezer for many years, from what I remember. So very delicious. 3 years
Yes.
out from the freezer.
Yeah. Sometimes very delicious. A bit of a preference thing, though. Anyways, this is the most ridiculous description I think we've come up with yet, but hopefully that helps. Again, just to drive the point home, if Onsemi's customers want more of those tasty cakes, they buy more equipment from Aehr and Axcelis. If their customers want fewer of those cakes, they tell Aehr and Axcelis, hey, maybe we don't need as much equipment as before. Hold off for now. All right, Casey, let's talk about some financial valuations here and provide kind of our high level takeaways. At the end of 2023, we said that the downturn was coming for these companies. We're now in full swing, but we called Onsemi one of our top chip stock picks for 2024 back in January. We've been nibbling on Aehr test systems. We've begun nibbling on Axcelis technologies as well. And you can see that for all three here, Axcelis at about 18 times trailing 12-month earnings, Onsemi and Aehr at about 16 and 20 times earnings, respectively. Fast forward to today, beginning of May 2024, you can actually see Onsemi's earnings and free cash flow have actually improved a little bit. Onsemi down to just 14 times trailing 12-month earnings. That metric probably going to, again, more than likely get worse in Q2 because of their accelerating downturn in the spring quarter. But free cash flow actually getting better. Again, like you said, Casey, the company backing off on equipment purchases, which is boosting free cash flow profitability. That's why Aehr and Axcelis have been getting hit harder than Onsemi. Aehr and Axcelis make the equipment to bake the cakes. And so you can see Aehr now deteriorating down to 22 times trailing 12-month earnings, Axcelis 15 times trailing 12-month earnings. Both of those metrics likely to get worse when they report their spring quarters in June and July in just a couple more months. So this is why we had said that we were going to be focused on semi as a top chip stock for us in 2024 during the downturn, and have been nibbling or dollar cost averaging on Aehr and Axcelis Technologies stocks.
Our outlook on these three companies, on Semiconductor, Axcelis Technologies, and Aehr Test Systems, hasn't changed. And we're still continuing to nibble on these stocks as they have this downturn.
Just to recap, Onsemi is our favorite in the midst of the downturn because of the more stability in profit margins. We really like the position that Axcelis is in right now. They have well over $500 million in cash sitting on their balance sheet and no debt. That puts them in pretty good shape to, it sounds like they're probably in advanced talks to make some sort of acquisition to strengthen their business in the midst of this downturn. It's a fantastic place to be in. But Aehr Technologies as well, one that we like their strategic positioning. They don't really have any good competitors that can compete with them technologically, at least at this particular stage. But both of those companies, as the equipment makers, a bit more volatile. So that's why Onsemi is among our favorites for 2024. But Aehr and Axcelis, we're kind of nibbling through this downturn. We don't know when the downturn will be finished and when we'll be looking at a full-blown recovery. But as we've stated for the last 6 months or so, it looks like the second half of 2024 is when things will start to rally, will start to rebound for the auto and industrial markets, for power chips. It looks like we're in the midst of the bottom right now. So our outlook has not changed. We're not calling a bottom for the market. Rather, we just like to accumulate stocks like this throughout the downturn, and so that we have the position that we want when the ultimate new growth cycle picks up pace again, which is exactly what we did for the consumer and traditional cloud markets, like Qualcomm, for example, in the consumer market, which is now in the midst of the beginnings of a new growth cycle. We're doing the same thing here for auto and industrial and just gradually accumulating shares of the companies we like most throughout the nasty down cycle.
Everyone, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It's a free and easy way to support us here at Chipstock Investor. Make sure you stay tuned for some coming portfolio updates from us. We're going to do a fairly major shift, and we'll let you all know what that is in one of our upcoming videos. We also have cybersecurity companies that we're going to review this week, as well as a quantum computing deep dive that we're working on. Make sure you check out our link below to our Ko-fi shop that has all of our published manuals there for sale. Or if you're into a membership, you can join here on YouTube or over on Ko-fi, and that gets you access to our Discord channel along with all of our show notes. So everyone have a great rest of your day, and we will see you again very soon at Chipstock Investor.